Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple more seconds as people join, so just bear with us. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. My name is Caroline Seymour. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing here at Zerto, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today, the IT Uninterrupted webinar series we have, and we are talking about today how to evaluate and lock in your container data strategy, data protection strategy. And I have two special guests with me today. First off, I have Christophe Bertrand, who is a senior analyst at ESG. And ESG is an IT analyst research and validation and strategy firm, and they provide market intelligence and insight to the global IT community. So welcome, Christophe, and thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. And then we have our own esteemed Deepak Verma, who is a technology evangelist and strategist here at Zerto. So welcome, Deepak. Great to have you too.
Thanks, Caroline.
Excellent. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about, as we said, data protection for containers. And so we wanted to break this up into three key areas and talk about, first, what is the current landscape for containers in production? Second, take a look at some of the key requirements for data protection of containers. And then, how are organizations currently protecting the data in containers and how effective that is today? And so without further ado, if we get started, and what I'd like to do is ask Christophe to talk about a recent survey that ESG has done, and that survey is about data protection trends and strategies for containers. And that was a survey with IT operations professionals. And so, Christophe, can you give us some background to that survey?
Yes, absolutely, Caroline. So as you can see, what we wanted to do as a research firm is to really understand not only the sentiment on data protection about containers, but really understand what the market is, what are people doing or not doing. And we also evaluated the methodologies or the understanding of some of the methodologies that are being used. All of the respondents, as you can see on the right-hand side, are essentially IT professionals. So we have a pretty large sample. This was a North American sample that we surveyed in the June timeframe. And what this does, it really gives us a very good understanding of what the drivers are today, what will happen next. Of course, we always ask future leaning type of questions. And our sample also allowed us to look at what mid-market organizations do, as well as enterprises. So lots of great data, and we're going to go through some of that in the next few minutes.
Excellent. So let's first of all talk about, from that survey itself, perhaps you could talk about what you're seeing or what you saw from the survey in terms of the prevalence of container adoption.
Absolutely. So it's really full speed ahead when you think about it. Many organizations use containers, and when you think about where they are today, what you see is a breakdown of, in terms of platforms, of about a quarter using containers versus 40% on virtual machines and the rest on bare metal servers. That's typically how you'd run your applications. Now project yourself 24 months from now, based on, again, what these highly qualified respondents told us. What we're seeing is that containers become that almost 40%. Actually, it becomes even more prevalent than virtual machines as a place or methodology to run applications. And I think that's very important because, as you know, first of all, today, we have a bunch of virtual machines in production. We have a bunch of containers in production. Are these protected in a coherent fashion? 24 months from now, the majority will be containers, and clearly, for this reason, a very solid and robust data protection strategy must be in place, not only today, but certainly looking ahead.
So as you've just talked about, Christophe, and the fact that this is really full speed ahead. So Deepak, maybe, I know you've been doing a lot of work with customers around containers and some of our early adopter customers as we announced our Zerto for Kubernetes, but Does this match what you're seeing from Zerto's early adopter customers?
Yeah, Caroline, so I've been talking with our customers as well as our early adopters and those customers that are movers and shakers in this space for almost a year now. And the level at which we're talking within the IT organization, it's been an interesting shift. What was once thought to be just a developer-led technology is now moved into IT. When an IT director tells me that we need to have a service out for our developers, they're asking for it, to me that becomes reality. And the underlying theme that they're almost kind of sick of hearing now is, we will develop all of our new applications using a new methodology. And that new methodology will have a place in containers and doesn't have a place in traditional VM. So that shift is definitely happening, and it echoes what Christophe's finding in his survey.
Excellent. So the two. And then as we look at sort of container adoption and we look at organizations overall, perhaps, Christophe, can you share with us sort of what you're seeing from who manages the day-to-day operations of container-based application environments?
It's a very interesting question. If you think about who's involved, as you can see from the left-hand side of the slide here in the research we have, you can see that IT ops and DevOps are obviously very important to the decision-making process and to the operational involvement in containers. So if you think about data protection, if you're more focused on the data protection side of the house, you're going to have to make sure that you're actively engaging with DevOps, with IT ops, and of course the application development team. So as Deepak was certainly explaining from his observations in the field, it's about the apps and where they're going to run. So there has to be a good understanding. Now, the other thing that's interesting is it's become so important now that there are individuals whose job it is to actually manage the containers. So these are, again, people that are going to be very important to talk to as you build the data protection strategy for those environments.
Excellent. So moving on from sort of who's in charge and who's who in the organization, what about the applications themselves? What are the sort of applications that are popular for container hosting?
Yeah, so as we looked at the the various environments that are supported by containers, we offered a number of options here. So what you can see, it doesn't add up to 100% because people could answer provide multiple answers. And of course, it makes sense. It's a very blended environment. So here we were asking specifically, tell us about the workloads. Tell us about the applications that are going to be that are supported today or that are running today on your container environment. So on the right hand side, you see sort of a lineup, and it's pretty obvious. Databases are pretty important, as well as in a broader term, sort of the migration of applications to cloud. As you know, you say container, you mean immediately hybrid, and of course cloud, and we'll see multi-cloud, but that's for a couple of minutes from now. And of course, lots of web applications, transactional applications, etc. The one thing about containers and the data that goes with it, and it's what you see with the little arrows that I put together, how it connects to the data and what type of storage it's on is going to be very important. So persistent storage versus sort of ephemeral doesn't really, it's here, it's there, it goes away, it comes back. There are very different ways of managing sort of the whole construct between the application, the data, and the metadata that goes with it, and all of the various levels in between. And I'm calling this out because as we go forward, you'll see that it's a very important consideration if you're the data protection strategist, or if you're just thinking about what would be the right way to approach this. I need to really understand where the data is, what type of storage it is, and therefore the type of solution I have to put in place to really get to that level of orchestration where I know where the application is, where the data is, and what's where and when. I say this, but it's really super critical. There is so much going on with containers. It happens so quickly. It's very easy to lose track.
Yeah, so let's just talk a little bit more about the data side of it, but also maybe Deepak, you could share your sort of insights first with sort of the, in regard to the applications that customers are running, but specifically as Christophe was talking about, the persistent data and how they're addressing the data needs from what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting, the survey results that Christophe had. I'm pretty sure if we did the survey 2 years ago, the graph maybe would be the other way around. So what I mean by that is that Containers had this place to have this notion of, oh, there's no state in them, so they're essentially stateless. They ran a lot of front-end applications such as web, etc. But what we're seeing is an evolution that's been happening here. It's great if you're running it in a stateless environment, but the state for that application has to come from somewhere, and that's traditionally been in VMs. But as customers are getting away from that VM notion, re-architecting its applications, they're starting to ask the question, where's that state going to live if it's not going to be in a VM? And there's really an evolution to either moving to databases as a service, services. These could be hosted on public cloud or other areas, but that provides, you know, a challenge. You're just moving the persistent data from one monolith to kind of another monolith, and you have very limited flexibility in a microservices architecture. Where we're seeing that, where I'm seeing that evolution, and it really aligns exactly with what Christophe has shared, is as that persistence comes into the container itself, and that has grown and matured over the last year, the higher-end applications such as databases can live within containers, which is where customers are seeing it, because it's a lot easier to deploy a microservice where a couple of containers are stateful and the rest are stateless. So definitely aligns with that the evolution is towards having persistence within containers, because that gives you ultimate flexibility, and that's what the name of the game here is.
Okay, so what we're saying here is the fact that we know that persistent storage and containers go hand in hand. So maybe we sort of move on to sort of the second element of our discussion here today and talk about where does data protection fit, and look at some of the sort of the key requirements. So maybe Christophe, you want to sort of share from the survey what you're seeing from the key requirements?
Yes, so there are a number of capabilities that we ask respondents to tell us about. And what you can see doesn't add up to 100%, because as you can imagine, there are many facets and many type of features that come into picking a solution. So this is really these are the type of areas that you'd want to inspect as you build an RFP, as you're engaging with a vendor to look at a solution for backup and recovery and disaster recovery for containers. Obviously, multi-cloud is very important. It's absolutely the top of the list, and that's simply the nature of the animal. Access to APIs is a very important one, and I'll say that this is where I would really spend more time than maybe in the past looking at other type of environments for backup recovery, simply because APIs are very critical to the orchestration and the sort of inclusion of containers in what is a hybrid infrastructure. Also, I was pleased to see reporting being really kind of almost at the top of the list, simply because I think in the past reporting was an afterthought, and here you really can't control what you can manage, and reporting is going to be very important. Now, obviously, lots of other important features. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think it really speaks for itself, but I would say you want your top sort of sections in your RFP. That's what the market says.
Okay, so Deepak, maybe what you could share with us is some of the architectural considerations that you've seen with customers as we're looking at sort of the applications that Christophe has been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's no secret we've been working on our Zerto for Kubernetes for almost a year. So I've been talking to a lot of customers, and I wish I had Christophe's survey data earlier. One of the things that our customers love about our existing product is our user interface and how easy it is. Whereas in this space, it was very interesting to see that the first thing they gravitated towards was give me an API to be able to manage it. So what we're calling data protection as code. Give me a piece of code that I can inject into my work streams and manage Zerto with. And along with that, focus around the application itself. So it's very little, persistent data is important, but there's a lot of context around the application itself. I'm not going to talk about the RPOs and RTOs here, but as it becomes mission critical, that's obviously top of mind, that the expectation is not to get worse as we move to a newer platform than what we've had in the past. So tighter RPOs and RTOs is definitely a requirement. And I'm glad that, Christophe, you mentioned the reporting aspect. That's one area where I think most people want to go visual. So that's where we've, I even thought of and integrated into our visual side of the product. But it lines up with what we're seeing and what I've seen from a lot of what I'll call our design customers that we've talked with over the last year as we've been designing our product and coming out with the specific features. So these definitely do line up very effectively.
Yeah. So Christophe also mentioned in the survey about multi-cloud. So let's talk a little bit about sort of cloud and hybrid, cloud strategies and how prevalent is that. So maybe we could delve a little bit more into that, Christophe.
Yes, absolutely. So on the left-hand side, you see this sort of the lineup in terms of where people are today. Tell us about what best describes your environment. And as you can see, it's a hybrid world. It's kind of what I was sort of hinting at earlier. Now, there are people who are 100% cloud on the left-hand side. That's about 1 in 5, and that's important because that means everything that they do container-wise will live in the cloud, meaning the data protection strategy has to live in the cloud too and be very friendly with those public hyperscaler type of environments. So that's one level of skill set you need to have if you want to play. I want to be very clear. That's the direct consequence of that statement. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people will be in a hybrid sort of deployment. That's the vast majority. I expect these numbers will vary a bit over time. We'll see what it looks like in a couple of years, but I would still pretty much bet on that being the majority over a long period of time, meaning I'll have some container environments and applications in the cloud. I'll have some on premises. They will be on one cloud one day or another one the other, or they'll move around. There are still lots of migrations happening. So I think it's clear you have to prepare yourself for a hybrid sort of world here. Very few will only have containers on sort of self-contained environments and on-prem. Now, of course, now you look at that and compare and contrast with the backup and recovery strategy, and it's sort of a double click on what I call the RFP. As you could see, look, it's super important to have essentially a solution that's going to be multi-cloud. 45% said it better be multi-cloud. Now, given that we're still early, I think, in the adoption of containers, as we know, it's going to really become very much mainstream in terms of where you have your applications live and run moving forward in 24 months. So another essentially half are saying, well, it's important, but I would still prefer a multi-cloud solution. So I think it kind of gives you the general idea that if you're not looking at a vendor that has a multi-cloud or native multi-cloud type of solution for backup and recovery, it's probably not going to be the right choice.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the cloud migration.
Yeah, I just hinted at that, and obviously one of the big questions is I want to be able to now move. I'm in a hybrid world, right? And mm-hmm. I want to be able to migrate my workloads and my containers and my environments to different places, multi-cloud. As you can see, it's pretty obvious. Today organizations can actually move their container environments across clouds, which is important. So that's kind of a great starting point. I think for those organizations that do it, they've already baked that in, which is what you see multi-cloud as a requirement for backup and recovery. It's not because it doesn't come out of the blue, oh yeah, it'd be nice. It's because that's what I'm doing on the prod side for my containers. I'm multi-cloud already. So that's kind of a confirmation, if you will, or an explanation, if you will. Mm-hmm. What's interesting on the right-hand side is how do you today actually operate those migrations? And there are many ways you could do it, because remember, we talked about databases, we talked about the type of environments that are in play, and we talked about backup and recovery. So there are today multiple ways of potentially migrating those environments. It turns out that the majority, and here it could have multiple answers, so it doesn't add up to 100%, but the majority will actually use a backup and recovery or replication tool. And we've seen that in other types of technologies or environments where it's a great data mover. Why not leverage what I already have? Now, of course, you're still going to see some people using a specialized service or solution. And here's the thing, if you look at those numbers, a lot of people are still using scripts and API, hence the point that Deepak was making, hence the point that we saw earlier, that having a great integration with APIs matters. Now, the manual piece, the APIs, the scripts, I think it can work really well, but the question becomes now, how does it scale? And actually, I would say, how does it scale across the board, which is another dimension. So I think we see a hint here that leveraging existing data movement type of technologies may be a good way to really bake the migration component in. So it goes beyond backup and recovery. That's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and we'll take a closer look at the data protection strategies in a moment. But maybe Deepak, can you talk a bit about sort of what does all of this mean for data protection in container environments?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of interesting, right? And what's it's meant for us so far has been some of those underlying guiding principles as our design principles, which means whatever solution is out there for data protection has to span across multiple platforms, which means not just on-prem, but also across. And where that really comes from is I've heard customers say, hey, look, right now we're running containers on virtual machines, but ultimately our objective is to maybe go to physical, or we're going to move that workload to a cloud of our choice. Pick any one of the major hyperscalers. We want all of those as options. And oh, by the way, your platform should be able to move along and work exactly, because that's the promise of containers and Kubernetes. It works exactly the same on my laptop as it would on a cloud platform. So that's where the hybrid nature comes in as well, in that we don't know where the source and target is. If I ask 5 customers, what is your choice for your source and your target, I'm going to get 10 answers. Because it's kind of interesting that those decisions are not made yet, and sometimes they'll switch hyperscalers based on the services a hyperscaler is providing around the container platform. So from our design perspective, it's been kind of interesting in that we have to address all of the platforms that they can come up with on-prem, as well as the platform choices on cloud, and they want that solution to be holistic. So it does line up with what Christophe is seeing. And the challenge that kind of comes to mind is how are existing solutions actually being able to manage that? Because as we know, a lot of existing solutions weren't built for cloud. It didn't exist 5-10 years ago.
Right. And so that sort of segues us into the last section that we wanted to actually talk about, because we've said that organizations are utilizing, containers for different applications, for a variety of applications, and particularly sort of with cloud, hybrid, multi-cloud seems to be very important too. So let's discuss sort of how organizations are protecting today. So the question therefore comes is, so are organizations being proactive with the data protection strategy for their container infrastructure? And maybe we could start off with you, Christophe.
Yeah, so the good news is I think a lot of people are being proactive, which is good. They've understood that, well, this have important applications running on these containers, and now I want to make sure that I protect the data assets and the environment that goes with it. Now, as Deepak was highlighting earlier, obviously having a very good understanding of the hybrid and the sort of the cloud environments matters. Now, the one thing that, of course, is maybe a telltale sign that there's a lot more maturity to be gained is the fact that a lot of people are still being reactive or really think of it as an afterthought. And that's a problem, because that means if you're on the left-hand side of this sort of chart, you're ahead of your skis, right? You're not taking into account as you deploy containers in what is essentially production environments and potentially mission-critical production environments, something that has a direct impact on the bottom line and the top line of the business, well, then if you don't have data protection baked in, you've got a problem, or a potential problem could happen. So sort of, I'm going to call it, a glass half full at this point, but leaning towards at least a good understanding that something needs to happen. And if you look at the next next slide, what you see is that there is a skill set issue. I sort of hinted at it. If you think about the skill sets that are needed to make container environments work, think about all of the components. You need to understand, obviously, containers themselves and Kubernetes and automation, orchestration, etc. You need to understand data protection. You need to understand or have a good integration into other processes, which may not have anything to do with backup and recovery, but maybe may have more to do with application development, DevOps, etc. Lots of different permutations, and the skill sets are just not there. So that compounds the potential risk. If you are not proactive and if you don't really have all the skill sets you need, that's going to be a problem. Now, it's not the end of the world yet. The sky's not falling. There are some shortages of skill sets. Okay. I just want to point that out because I think a lot of organizations find themselves caught in this in this problem of not having the right people, and that could affect not only how they execute, but also the cost of the deployment if they have to go get outside resources, which is another important point to supplement their environment. So it could slow down their digital transformation as well.
Right. So maybe Deepak, you could talk a little bit about sort of maybe how we're addressing the disconnect around this.
Yeah, I'm glad to. So it's interesting, Christophe, you mentioned the lack of skills, and what resonated with me just now is the fact that the data protection person and the container orchestration person, the DevOps person, the application person are all different personalities, and you really need somebody who can intersect and bring that, and then you've narrowed down the scope of that skill set considerably. So what we did, and this was a thoughtful action on our part, is we started looking at how data protection would be deployed, and really had an opportunity to break away from that traditional model of data protection as an afterthought. Usually, the 11th hour of when you're deploying an application, say, oh, how are we going to back this up? And how are we going to protect this? How are we going to migrate this when 3 years down the line? So what we did was we introduced something called data protection as code. So as the DevOps folks, as the dev side of the DevOps, deploy their applications, all they have to do is essentially annotate that application to say, I want to be part of this protection group. Protection group is a Zerto concept to say a bunch of applications that need to be protected and migrated and moved and recovered together. And all they have to do is annotate that. They don't need to understand how data protection works. They don't have to understand how restores will work or how data actually moves across clusters, etc. But all they can do is say, put it into a protection group, into a Zerto protection group, and call it my app. So a backend database, maybe a front-end web, and all the other components of a 12-factor application, they just annotate that. So that essentially makes data protection part of your process of when the app is initially created and deployed, rather than a backend process. The second part of it is using a lot of APIs. So rather than having a data protection specialist person on the back end that would manage that and have to understand the applications, give APIs and appropriate access to the developers and the DevOps folks so that they can essentially perform a lot of the functions that they need to from a data protection standpoint, such as, maybe I want to roll back just a point in time of my application and manage it from that side. There'll still be a ops side of this, because they know ultimately where the infrastructure is. They know how the networks are connected. They know what the resources are available in terms of storage, in terms of compute, etc. Somebody still has to manage how the things are happening on the back end. But by breaking up data protection into two areas, I think this really lends itself to easing the burden on a customer to say, oh, now you have to find a data protection person who's also a container expert, who's also a DevOps person.
Yeah, it's quite a different approach though, Deepak, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, for our traditional Zerto customers, it's been a little surprising when I pull up a YAML file and show them a configuration, because they're used to the slick Zerto GUI. But I know I've hit the right audience when they say, this is perfect, thank you very much, I can run with this. Then you've made their life a lot simpler at that point in time.
That's great. That's great. So so maybe if for a little bit from the survey, Christophe, is what are you seeing from the fact that do organizations seem to understand the importance of these areas that we're sort of talking about here?
Well, actually, I have some detail on that, and it's well, the answer is no, they don't quite get it. Here we ask people a very simple question, which is, okay, do you believe, it's a sentiment question, so we did not go audit it, but I mean, look, these are IT professionals, they know what they're talking about. So do you think you should back up your container environment the way you traditionally back up your other apps and your other environments or infrastructure? And the answer was, oh yeah, no problem, 75%. Well, that's not true, not true at all. That's exactly what Deepak was explaining and showing you with the YAML files and how you nest some of the functions or break them down so that it can be API'd into other processes. And actually, if you look at the next bit of research we have, I break it down for you. This was a question we asked that was sort of a bit of a trick question, maybe you could say, where we said, okay, tell us what is needed to be successful in protecting essentially a container environment. So if you said container level backup, you're right, because that's really what it is. It's kind of a broad statement, I get it. It turns out we also actually broke down what it means. If you can see the arrow and all of the various components. And by the way, I should have added Kubernetes level in this as well. And that's really what it's made up of. And the point I want to make is that all of those should have been at the same level of if you knew what you were doing. And of course, you could do application level backup. You certainly should back up the data. That's important. You can do VM level snapshots. It's not necessarily going to give you, with those old school approaches, the level of reconciliation you really need to get for disaster recovery or for actual backup and recovery.
Okay. So, could you elaborate, and maybe Christophe, you could continue this with on where organizations are turning for container-specific data protection solutions based on what we've just talked about?
Sure. So, yeah. So if you look closely here at what we did, and I know it's a lot of words, so I'll first of all, it adds up to 100%. We asked a very simple question, which was, okay, obviously you're doing containers, so how does it integrate with your current schema or your current data protection infrastructure? And what you could see is about half, 46%, said, well, it is supported by a current backup vendor, and we're going to keep going. Okay, interesting, because I think actually there are a lot of backup vendors today who don't necessarily have all that they need for container backup and recovery, but that's what people said. So we'll go with that sentiment. And what's interesting is the other half said, yeah, well, we're using our current backup solution today, but really we're going to be using something else moving forward, container specific. And the reason why you see this answer, in my opinion, is people know because they're not at scale, they can probably get away with some manipulation and get away with it with their current solution, but they know they need something that's going to be further integrated really to be able to scale. Because everything is fun and games until you add at scale at the end of the sentence, right? Same thing applies here to containers. I think this is exactly what you're seeing. And then you can see that early adopters of people who are maybe more advanced actually use specific solutions already. It's about 8%. So again, these are not market share numbers or anything, but it gives you a pretty good sense for where this is going. And that means a majority will be using a solution that has certainly a very specific container strategy or set of capabilities to enable those backup and recovery strategies.
Right. So let's just ask that sort of really the last question. So what is the secret to effectively and adequately, protect your container environment? And maybe Deepak, you want to share?
Yeah. So I kind of alluded to us developing a net new platform because of the requirements, right? So right off the bat, it has to be an environment that's native to Kubernetes and runs as within the container environment. I think that's kind of key to that, because the last thing I want to be able to do if I want to protect a container environment is say, oh yeah, by the way, it all backs up to this Windows server sitting over here, which is what I've seen approaches from a lot of vendors in the market space. They'll force fit containers as just another application. It's just another database or et cetera that we protect. And I don't think that reaches the right goals. So I kind of broke it into two, right? Our approach has been based on all of the data that Christophe has shared. One is the persistent data itself. So first and foremost, let's protect the persistent data because that's the one component that can be redeployed. The whole notion of containers, Kubernetes, is that you can easily redeploy or roll back things as you want, but persistent data a lot of times is not easy to do. So with Zerto's journaling technology that we've built into Zerto for Kubernetes, you have that flexibility, and we're hitting RPOs of under 15 seconds, which means, hopefully, if you've done your container deployment properly and you're using the containers for application deployments, you're making dozens of changes in production on a daily basis. So that's the promise of DevOps. And if you're making dozens of changes, how are you going to remember to back that up a dozen times during the day? Well, with a continuous approach, it's always being backed up at every 15-second intervals, and you can easily go back to any point in time, which is very hard to achieve with traditional storage-based snapshots or even other VM-based snapshots or other means of that. I know, Christophe, if you have a comment on the persistent side before I talk about the app side of it.
Well, actually, you know what I wanted to comment is what you just said is actually so true. It's constantly changing, and therefore, if it's constantly changing, you cannot, against that, have something that's going to be point in time in nature, whether traditional backup or a snapshot, right? That's number one. The other thing is, if you look at the list on the right-hand side and you don't understand what those words are, as a technologist, you know you have a problem. I mean, secrets, what are secrets? There are no secrets in VMs. You know, the point I'm making to maybe emphasize the earlier findings in the research is that understanding is going to be key. The other thing about persistent storage is, look, containers come and go, that's great. The data, though, has to be maintained coherently in a state that allows you to recover it. And remember that you also have, just on top of everything else, the requirement or the need to think ahead in terms of what could happen with cyber attacks or problems of corruptions. So you still have to also understand that so you can recover to a point in time where everything is consistent. And just to confuse you even more, or add to the pile of things to do here, compliance. You have to be compliant, and the ability to audit trail what was where when, what happened, who modified what is going to be super important moving forward. So really, it's sort of shooting a moving target, but that's really what it's all about. That's why I think actually definitely CDP is a great way, you know, well integrated to actually capture everything as it happens.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that confirmation, because you're absolutely right. You don't know when might happen, and containers are not excluded from ransomware attacks and compliance. That's just the nature of the business. And then so, and on the right side, and yeah, thanks for that comment on not, if you don't understand it, then you've probably missed the mark. So what we did was, in addition to the persistent data, you know, what is needed to recreate that application on the other side? As far as Kubernetes is concerned, those are the elements of the application that get deployed. I may have a deployment, I may have secrets that are put into the Kubernetes, I may have services that are deployed. Those are the components that are easy to recreate, and that those are democratized across clusters. So if I was doing an application or creating an application on my laptop today and hyperscaler tomorrow and back to on-prem, those components, as long as I have them, I can recreate my application. So what we've done is captured not only the essence of what I'll say, the state out of the stateless application, but also the persistent data that goes along with it, because with the combination of the two, now you've got the ability to essentially recreate your application at any point in time, and then bundle that with it running in a Kubernetes native manner. It means we're portable. It means we're not reliant on the underlying infrastructure, and customers have the flexibility to move whatever their next gen platform will be for their next gen application. So this is kind of the approach that we've taken, you know, bundled with the API reporting that Christophe's already identified, and I think those are the ingredients that we need in order to have a successful data protection, disaster recovery, and even a migration solution within this environment.
That's great. Thank you both. And your insights have been invaluable, and I hope that the audience here today have got valuable information as they're looking at their evaluation of a container data protection strategy. We talked about the landscape overall. We talked about some of the key requirements and what you actually need to be doing. And as we've ended up here, we've gone through a lot of the survey that ESG did earlier, which is the data protection trends and strategies for containers. And so they have produced an ebook, and we're providing that, and you've got the link there, but we will be sending that out, and you can find that also on our website. And the other thing, because, you know, is I like what Christophe, you said, in the fact that this is in full swing. It's full steam ahead, and containers is adoption is increasing, and it's significant as it already is today. We also have a series of blogs as well that you can look at on Zerto.com to understand a little bit more too. So a lot of information that we can share, but certainly I think reading this ebook and getting more information around the data protection trends and strategies will help you as you look at your strategy within your organization. So what I'd like to do is thank you, Christophe. Thank you, Deepak, for being with us today. And I'd like to thank the audience for attending and hope that you have found this information useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.